The high desert wind pushed against the guardrail as if it, too, wanted him to step over. On the overlook above eastern Oregon's canyons, a single motorcycle stood under a fading sky, metal cooling, engine silent. Next to it, a man in a worn leather jacket rested his hands on the rail, eyes fixed on the drop below. He had been called a lot of things in his life. Tonight, on that lonely cliff, he was just a tired biker named Caleb Monroe, standing one small movement away from disappearing. And that was the moment a stranger walked out of the juniper trees with a bobcat at her side and quietly said, "My bobcat knows where your son is." The Overlook wasn't a tourist spot at this hour. It was the kind of place people visited when they needed to be alone with their ghosts. The canyon below was all shadow and stone, carved over ages by water that no longer ran. Twait turned the rock walls blue, the kind of blue that made you remember every winter of your life. Caleb's boots were scuffed from miles of highway. His Harley had carried him from town to town for months, chasing rumors of a missing young man in work boots and a camera bag. His son. The police had stopped calling back. Friends had gone back to their lives. Even the flyers he'd taped to gas station windows had curled and fallen away. Out here, with the cold coming up off the canyon, it felt like the world had already decided how this story ended. Not as an inspirational story, just another quiet tragedy no one would ever hear about. He leaned a little farther over the rail, thinking about how fast it would be. No more ache in his chest, no more waking up with his son's name in his throat. Just silence. Then gravel crunched behind him. Not the heavy tread of boots, something softer, measured, almost padded. "Sir?" The voice was low, steady, a woman's voice carrying just enough to reach him over the wind. Caleb didn't turn right away. The world had taught him that strangers usually brought either trouble or sales pitches, and he had no room left for either. "I wouldn't lean any farther," she added. "Wind shifts hard up here." Something in the way she said it, not alarmed, not dramatic, just factual and kind, made him step back half an inch. That was all. But sometimes, half an inch is the difference between was and still here. When he finally turned, he saw her. A woman in her late 50s or early 60s, hair pulled back under a faded ball cap from some wildlife refuge. Jacket zipped against the chill, hands empty, open, visible. She had the look of someone who'd spent most of her life outside, a little weathered, a lot observant. And walking at her heel, on a long leather lead, was a bobcat. Its coat was thick and mottled, spots and stripes blending into the colors of the rock behind it. Short tail twitching, tufted ears forward, eyes locked not on the canyon, but on Caleb. For a moment, his brain rebelled. Bobcats belonged on nature documentaries, not at highway pullouts next to lonely men and rusted guardrails. The woman stopped at a respectful distance away. No rush, no reaching, just breathing the same cold air as him. "You're Caleb Monroe," she said softly. "The biker is looking for his missing son." He stiffened. The question he asked came out rough. "Who told you that?" "Everybody at the last gas station down the road," she answered. "Small towns repeat names that carry that much pain." The bobcat stepped forward, muscles rolling under its fur, nose lifting to catch his scent. Gab instinctively shifted his weight, but the animal didn't crouch or bare its teeth. It just studied him. Calm, focused. "This is Coda," the woman went on. "I'm Grace. We work with the wildlife rehab center out by the timberline, and I know how this is going to sound, but I need you to hear it all the way through." Caleb gave a humorless snort. "Lady, I've heard every kind of nonsense for the last year. Psychics, dreams, a guy who tried to sell me a map. Try me." Grace nodded as if she'd expected that answer. She looked down at the bobcat, then back at Caleb. "Coda was found 3 months ago," she said. "Half-starved, foot torn up, sleeping in an abandoned shed near the rail tracks. We sedated him, patched him up, and tagged him. But here's the strange part. We checked the game cameras around that shed. Your son was there, Caleb, a few weeks before the cat. The canyon wind seemed to pause. You don't know my son, Caleb said. You don't know he's mine just because someone told you. Grace took a small step closer, careful, like approaching a skittish deer. He came into our center once, she replied. Said his name was Eli. Young guy, camera bag, old jacket that had seen too many winters. He brought photos of this very overlook. Talked about how the light here was soulful. His word, not mine. Said it made even broken things look almost happy. Caleb's breath hitched. Elle used that word for light. Soulful. He'd said it about sunsets over truck stops, headlights on wet pavement, the glow inside a diner at midnight. Grace watched his face, reading the flicker that passed through it. People her age had learned to read emotions without being told. When your boy slept in that shed, she continued quietly, Koda was nearby. Same tracks, same nights. Bobcats don't do loyalty the way dogs do, but they know safety. They know whose campfire smoke means no harm. When we released Koda back to the edge of his territory, we thought he'd head for the usual outcrops. Instead, he kept coming back to the same direction, same scent line, always angling toward these cliffs. She let that sit. The bobcat flicked his ears, as if listening too. I was at the gas station, Grace added, when they mentioned a biker who rode in once a month, asking about a missing son with a camera. Did you look like you were carrying the whole world on your shoulders? I saw your bike tonight from the road. And Koda? She glanced down. Koda went rigid in the crate the moment he caught your scent. The bobcat stepped closer now, stopping just shy of Caleb's boots. He could see the fine whiskers, the steady golden eyes. Not tame, never that. But not wild in the way that meant danger. The cat raised his nose, breathing him in, tail giving one small, deliberate twitch. There was no magic glow, no movie moment, just an animal doing what animals do, trusting its senses. Still, something inside Caleb shifted. There is a kind of loyalty that lives in animals. Not the loyalty of promises and rings and contracts, but of familiarity, of shared nights under the same roof or the same sky. They remember who fed them, who didn't shout, who moved slowly and spoke softly when the world was loud. We tell moral stories about loyalty and love as if they belong only to people. Yet anyone who has ever lost a dog, a cat, or watched a bobcat through a screen and felt their chest ache knows animals keep a different kind of record, a quiet one. Grace's voice softened. I can't promise you this ends like the heartwarming stories people pass around online, she said. This isn't a fairy tale, but I believe Koda can take us where your son was last, maybe where he still is. The way he's reacting to you, to this place, I would bet my own name on it. Caleb's fingers tightened on the cold rail. Hope had become a dangerous word in his world. Hope meant reopening wounds. Hope meant risking another fall. He looked down at the canyon, the hard way out. Then he looked at the bobcat, a wild thing offering a softer, stranger path forward. For many people in his age bracket, there comes a day when the phone grows quiet, the house feels bigger than it used to, and grief sits in the chair across from you like an uninvited roommate. On that day, any small act of kindness feels like a lifeline. A nurse's hand on your arm, a neighbor's casserole, or a stranger at a highway overlook who refuses to let you disappear. Grace didn't push. She simply stood there, sharing the cold, giving him space to choose. Why would you do this? He finally asked. Because someone once followed my lost brother into the woods and brought him home, she answered. We don't always get that kind of love twice in one life, but when we do, we don't turn away. The words settled over the overlook like a blanket. Not noisy, not dramatic, just steady. Caleb looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from the wind, from the weight of a decision. He stepped back from the guardrail, just one full step, but it felt like crossing a border. "All right," he said quietly. "If your bobcat thinks he knows where my boy is, we follow him." Grace exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for the last 5 minutes. She loosened the lead and touched Coda's shoulder. "Okay, Wildheart," she murmured. "Show us." The bobcat turned away from the canyon, ears pointed toward the dark line of pines beyond the parking lot. Without hesitation, he started down the narrow service trail, paws silent on the gravel. Grace fell in behind him. Caleb hesitated for the briefest moment, glancing back once at the guardrail. The wind blew against his face, colder now, but he felt strangely lighter. Then he followed. As we walk with them into that quiet tree line, a biker, a stranger, and a wildcat carrying more than instinct in his bones. I'd like you to stay close to this story. Notice whose face comes to mind when you hear about loss or love or the fragile thread of loyalty that still holds us here. Because in the next part, when Coda leads them off the pavement and into the dark, what they find among the pines will begin to change everything. Before a stranger walked out of the trees with a bobcat at her side, Daniel's life had already been drifting toward an edge for a very long time. The cliff was just the first place you could actually see it. Years earlier, in the little mill town of Riverbend, Daniel's days had a rhythm. The garage door opened at 8. The coffee pot sputtered to life. The same old truck pulled in every Monday, complaining in the same old way. He wasn't rich, but he was needed. People brought their cars, their bikes, their worries about strange noises in the engine. Daniel listened with the same quiet attention he'd later offer a stranger on a cliff. Back then, his hands smelled like motor oil and soap. His name, painted on the front window, still meant something. At home, there was another rhythm. His wife Laura at the stove, humming along with the radio. His son Michael was at the tiny kitchen table, flipping through a tattered photography magazine, pointing out dream places he wanted to capture someday. "Look at the way the light hits here, Dad," Michael would say, tapping a page. "It feels soulful." Daniel would grunt, half listening, half worrying about parts orders and unpaid invoices. He loved his boy deeply, but like a lot of men of his generation, he didn't always know how to show it. His love came out as full gas tanks, paid phone bills, and a hand on the shoulder that squeezed just a little too hard. Then one afternoon, life dropped out from under them faster than any jack could lift a car. Laura collapsed in the grocery store aisle between the canned beans and the dish soap. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing anyone could do. A quiet stroke, they said. No warning, no second chances. One morning, she was packing Daniel's lunch, reminding him gently that the world needed a little more kindness. That night, the house sounded like a stranger's house. Too big, too quiet. The seat at the end of the couch stayed empty, and the space she'd filled with laughter and ordinary questions was suddenly just air. Grief is strange. It doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it looks like a man turning on the TV and never turning it off. Sometimes it looks like a bottle of cheap whiskey on the kitchen counter that slowly becomes the only thing that never leaves. For a while, Michael tried to hold the pieces together. He closed up the shop when Daniel forgot. He drove his father home from the bar after someone called to say, he's had enough. He taped the past due notices in a neat stack on the fridge, hoping the sight of them would wake his father up. There's one night they both remember for different reasons. Daniel remembers it as a blur of anger and sharp words. Michael remembers every word. The night had started off ordinary enough. A cold dinner on the table, the TV is muttering in the background, a voicemail from a client saying they'd taken their car somewhere else. Daniel poured himself one drink, then another, chasing the hollow feeling that never seemed to fill. Michael came in carrying a small stack of his printed photos. He'd picked up a part-time job shooting landscapes for a local magazine. In the pictures, the world was washed in colors that didn't look forced or fake. Just honest. A drizzly riverside, a field of dead grass backlit by evening sun. A stray dog is sleeping near the tracks. Nothing fancy, somehow still beautiful. "Dad, they actually paid me," he said, trying for a light tone. "It's not much, but it's something. Maybe I could—" The glass hit the table a little too hard. "Photography," Daniel snapped. "That's your big plan? Pointing a camera at weeds and calling it work?" Michael swallowed. He'd heard this tone before. "It makes me happy," he said quietly. "And they liked my stuff. Maybe I can build something." Daniel stood up too fast. The room tilted, and he caught himself on the back of the chair. "Happy doesn't put a roof over your head," he growled. "Happy won't keep the lights on. You think life is some kind of fairy tale? Real men work. They don't chase pictures." There it was. The word hung in the air like smoke. Real men. Michael's face went still. For a moment, he looked eerily like Laura when she'd been disappointed in Daniel. Not angry, just deeply tired. "Why is it," he asked softly, "that everything I love, you make small?" The question might have landed differently on a sober night. On a drunk one, it felt like a challenge. "You're not tough enough to be my son," Daniel muttered. "You don't know what hard even is." That's the sentence Michael heard loudest. Not the slurred words before it, not the regret that followed. Just that one line, like a knife. Later that night, after the house went quiet, there was a moment. Daniel stood outside Michael's bedroom door, sober enough to feel the shame settling in. He held a mug of coffee in one hand, the apology trembling on his tongue. If you've ever had that moment, hand on a doorknob, heart pounding, rehearsing the words, "I'm sorry," and wondering if it's too late or too early, you know how heavy that handle can feel. On the other side of the door, he could hear drawers sliding open, the rustle of a duffel bag. He could have walked in. He could have said, "I was wrong. I'm scared. I miss her too." Instead, he stepped back, told himself, "We'll talk in the morning." In the morning, the bed was neatly made. The closet was half empty, and Michael was gone. No slammed doors, no dramatic note, just a quiet exit from a house that had stopped feeling like home. Over the next few years, Daniel got postcards instead of conversations. A canyon in Utah, a pier in Washington. The back of each card carried a few lines. "The light here is amazing. You'd love the way it hits the water." Or, "Working odd jobs, still shooting. Hope you're okay." Daniel pinned the cards to the garage wall and told himself his son was just finding himself. But under that stubborn shell, guilt gnawed. He had learned the hard way that loyalty isn't only about staying when times are easy. It's about staying when grief makes everyone hard to live with. Everyone. When word eventually came, not official, not final, just a pattern of silence that stretched too long, that Michael hadn't been heard from for months, something in Daniel snapped. He sold most of what was left in the garage, kept a few essential tools and a photo of Laura taped inside his helmet. Then he rolled his old touring bike out into the light, engine coughing to life like an old friend who'd waited patiently for years. The next chapter of his life was written in miles. Cheap motel rooms, truck stop coffee, police stations in small towns, where he'd slide a picture across the counter and ask, "Have you seen him?" Most days, the answer was no. Some days, someone would say, "Maybe," and point him toward another town, another rumor. If you've ever driven alone for hours with the radio off, you know how loud your own thoughts can become. On those long stretches of highway, Daniel replayed that night with the coffee mug and the bedroom door. He replayed 10,000 smaller moments where he'd chosen silence over humility, pride over a simple, healing apology. These aren't the kind of moral stories that feel neat. They're not the heartwarming stories where everyone hugs in the middle and bakes cookies. They're messier, more real. And for many people listening right now, they might feel uncomfortably familiar. Maybe you too have a sentence you wish you could unsay. A child, a sibling, a friend you wish you'd called back sooner. If there's one quiet lesson that begins to rise here, it's this. Love doesn't always fail in a single dramatic scene. Sometimes it frays slowly, thread by thread, every time we decide, I'll fix it later.
By the time we meet Daniel on that overlook, staring into the canyon, his road has been worn smooth by empty miles, regret,
And a grief that never learned how to speak. He's convinced himself that there is no happy ending left for him, no place for kindness, no soft landing, no second chance at being the father he once thought he'd be. And yet, somewhere far from that cliff, a bobcat is already pacing the fence line of a rehab center. A young girl is already pouring her hurt into the fur of a wild animal who refuses to leave her side. Life is quietly lining up pieces Daniel can't see yet. In a moment, we'll walk into their part of the story, into Emma's world, and the strange bond between a child and a bobcat who remembers the scent of a missing man. Before we do, I'd invite you to hold one simple question in the back of your mind. If you had one more chance to knock on a door you walked away from, what would you want to say? If you want to see what grief looks like in a child, you don't always look for tears. Sometimes you look for the chair no one else is allowed to sit in, the sweater that never gets washed because it still holds a familiar smell. That was Emma. In the little town of Riverbend, mornings in Rose's house had become very quiet. The clock in the kitchen ticked a little too loudly. The radio stayed off, more days than it stayed on. At the small round table, there were 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and one girl who hardly ever finished her cereal. Emma sat in the same chair every day, the one that used to face her mother's seat. Even though that seat was empty now, she kept talking to that space in small ways. A glance, a half-formed sentence, a hand hovering over the table as if reaching for someone who wasn't there. Her mother, Hannah, had been gone for almost 2 years. A car accident on a winter road. One moment a phone call, the next moment a whole future rewritten. Her father, Michael, had lasted a little longer. He tried to work, taking photography jobs in the forests and along the coast, sending money back, sending the occasional picture of a sunset or a river. Then, 6 months ago, he simply stopped coming home. No more calls, no more transfers, just silence. Emma had lost both parents before she turned 10. On the outside, she looked okay, in the way adults sometimes say when they don't know what else to say. She went to school. She did her homework. She answered politely. But she moved carefully, like someone walking across a frozen lake, afraid every step might crack something open. Grief in children often looks like that. Not dramatic speeches, just a slow shrinking of the world until it feels small enough to manage. For Emma, that world was the same route to school, the same spot on the couch, the same faded hoodie that used to smell faintly like her dad's camera bag and pine-scented soap. Rose watched all of this with a heart that never really stopped aching. She'd buried a daughter, and now, differently, she'd lost a son-in-law to his own storm of pain and disappearance. She worried that, to Emma, she might feel like the last person left, but not enough. One Saturday, as Emma pushed her cereal around the bowl instead of eating it, Rose quietly decided it was time to try something different. Not a big speech, not a lecture about emotions, just a change of scenery. "How about a drive?" she asked. "There's a place I'd like you to see." Emma shrugged, but she got her coat. That was something. The Wildlife Rehab Center sat at the edge of town, where the last houses gave way to fields and dark fir trees. The air there always smelled like hay, damp earth, and something wild just beyond the fence. Claire, who ran the center, met them at the gate. She had the kind of calm presence Emma's teachers envied, eyes that noticed things, hands that moved slowly, a voice that never hurried.
"We take care of animals that got hurt or lost," Claire explained. "Most of them go back home once they're strong enough.
A few stay with us and help us teach kids about kindness to wild things." Emma nodded, but her gaze drifted past Claire toward the enclosures. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe just for something to feel new. That's when she saw him. In a larger pen, off to the side, a bobcat lay in the shade, front paws stretched out, coat the color of dried leaves and shadows. His tail flicked once, lazily. At first glance, he looked like part of the landscape. Then he opened his eyes. They were golden, sharp, and oddly calm,
Not tame, not soft, but focused.
"That's Copper," Claire said. "We found him a few months back. He'd been hit near the old service road. Foot torn up, ribs showing.
We're still not sure how long he'd been alone."
The word alone seemed to hang in the air. Copper's ears twitched.
He lifted his head, nostrils flaring as Emma stepped closer to the fence. There was a faint scent clinging to her jacket. Something she didn't notice, but Copper did.
Pine needles, wood smoke, the same aftershave her father wore on long days in the forest. For a long moment, the two of them just looked at each other. No baby talk, no big reactions. Just a girl who felt invisible and a wild animal who suddenly did not look away. Emma slowly reached out, stopping just short of the wire.
Copper stood, testing his sore paw for balance, and moved forward until his whiskers almost touched the fence. His breath puffed white in the cool air. In that simple act, a step closer instead of a step back, something small but real shifted inside her. Over the next weeks, Rose drove Emma back to the rehab center every chance she got.
The girl, who had once rushed straight to her room after school, now asked, "Do we have time to stop by the animals?" She never said, "I want to see Copper," out loud.
She didn't need to. Her feet chose the path for her. Sometimes she brought homework and read it sitting on an overturned bucket by the enclosure. Copper would lie down near the fence, eyes half closed, listening. When she stumbled over a word, his ear flicked, as if correcting her.
Some days, she didn't bring anything. She just talked. "It's picture day tomorrow," she told him once, tracing patterns in the dirt with one finger. "Everyone else will have both parents there. Grandma says she'll come, but it feels like when we line up, I'll have a space behind me. Like the photos in our hallway with gaps in them."
Copper didn't answer, of course. He just breathed, slow and steady, the rise and fall of his shoulders a quiet metronome. His presence didn't fix anything. It just meant she wasn't alone with the thoughts. One rainy afternoon, they found Emma curled up on an old cushion near the enclosure wall, her forehead pressed against the mesh, tears soaking the sleeve of her hoodie. Copper sat as close as he could on his side, almost mirroring her posture.
"I don't know why everyone leaves,"
she whispered, voice raw.
"Mom, Dad, even my friends stopped asking me over after a while. I must be hard to love."
If you've ever heard a child say something like that, you know it can split your heart in two. Rose stood back, hand over her mouth.
Claire put a gentle arm around her shoulders to keep her from rushing in, from rescuing the moment away.
Sometimes grief needs to speak before comfort can mean anything. When Emma's crying slowed, she rubbed her nose on her sleeve and looked up at Copper.
"You didn't leave,"
she said simply.
"You got hurt, and you're still here."
It wasn't a big declaration,
but it was the first time she'd drawn a line between her pain and someone else's survival. A different kind of love and loyalty, written in fur and scar tissue. One evening, back in the kitchen, Rose tried to find the right words.
"You like that bobcat a lot, huh?"
she asked, pouring tea, watching Emma carefully. Emma thought about it for a long moment, the spoon turning slowly in her mug. "I think," she said, choosing each word.
"I think Copper is my faith right now."
Rose frowned gently.
"What do you mean, honey?"
Emma shrugged, embarrassed.
"I mean, when I'm with him, I don't feel left over.
I feel like someone's still waiting for me. Like maybe not everyone I love disappears." For a girl who had already learned too much about loss, that was more than comfort. It was a small, stubborn kind of hope. Not loud, not the kind you shout about on social media, just the kind that lets you get out of bed and keep going. For those of us listening, especially if you've seen children or grandchildren go through hard things, this is where the story becomes more than just an inspirational story about a bobcat. It becomes a quiet mirror, a reminder that often the most heartwarming stories in our lives aren't the ones with perfect endings. They're the ones where someone, animal or human, simply refuses to walk away. That's a kind of kindness you don't forget. In time, Copper became more than an exhibit animal. He became Rose's reason to keep driving out of town, Emma's reason to speak out loud again, and Claire's reminder that healing isn't always about bandages and charts. Sometimes it's about giving hurt hearts, human and wild, a place to share the same air. Their bond wasn't cute in a fairy tale way. It was quieter, more soulful. The kind of connection that leaves you feeling a little more human just by watching it.
And while Emma sat by that enclosure, telling Copper about school and storms and the empty chair at home, she had no idea that this same bobcat had once shared a cold night not far from where her father slept. Somewhere in Copper's memory, the scent of Emma's jacket and the memory of another human blended into a single thread, a thread he would one day follow with surprising loyalty. In the next part of our story, that thread will be tested. Copper will smell something on the wind, exhaust, leather, the salt of old regret, and pull toward a man at the very edge of his own hope. Before we step onto that overlook with them, you might pause for just a second and think, who or what has quietly kept you company in your hardest seasons? A pet, a place, a person who didn't try to fix you, just stayed. Those are the bonds that change what happens when we finally reach our own cliff. Some sentences arrive in your life that sound too strange to take seriously. And yet, when you're standing at the end of everything you understand, those are sometimes the only sentences that feel like hope. My bobcat can find your son, that's what Emma said. Standing there at the overlook, wind tugging at her sleeves, Copper pressed against her leg like a small, wild shadow. A few minutes earlier, Daniel had been alone with the sound of his own breathing and the distant rush of the canyon below. He'd laid his helmet on the concrete barrier. In his wallet, the photo of Michael was worn almost transparent at the edges. He had already lived through 6 months of doing all the reasonable things, filing missing person reports, calling hospitals, driving from one county sheriff's office to another with the same pleading question. Have you seen this man? The answers blurred together. Adults are allowed to leave. No signs of foul play. We'll keep an eye out. Reason had led him in circles until the only straight line left pointed toward the edge of that cliff. Then Claire's truck had pulled in. Then Copper had fixed those golden eyes on him, body going still. Then Emma had stepped out from behind the open door, small hand wrapped in a lead clipped to a bobcat's harness. Sir? She'd said, her voice thinner than the wind but somehow more solid. Daniel had turned, expecting a tourist or a ranger. What he saw instead was a girl trying very hard to stand steady, and an animal that looked at him like he was not a stranger at all. Claire introduced herself quietly, explained the rehab center, and how Copper had been found near the old service road in the mountains. As she spoke, Copper kept inching closer to Daniel, nose lifted, nostrils flaring. There was something almost searching in it. Why is he doing that? Daniel asked, unable to keep the roughness out of his voice. Cats remember scent, Claire replied. Not just food or danger. They remember who made them feel safe. When we found Copper, your son had been staying not far from him. They shared that space, that smell. She gestured gently toward Daniel's jacket. Old leather, faint pine, a trace of the same soap Michael used on long trips. To Copper, she said, you don't smell like a stranger. You smell like the same story. It was a simple explanation, but it slid past Daniel's defenses in a way big speeches never had. Copper stepped close enough that Daniel could see the thin white line of a scar along his flank. He remembered what Emma had said at the rehab center, though he hadn't been there to hear it. You got hurt, and you're still here. Now, face to face with this animal, Daniel felt something similar rising in himself. He'd been hit hard by life, more than once. Maybe he was still here too. Emma tugged the lead just enough to get Copper to sit. Then she looked up at Daniel with those tired, steady eyes that seemed older than they should be. My dad was with him, she said, before Copper came to us. I can tell by the pictures, by the place, by what Ms. Claire showed me. Copper knows where he slept, where he walked. If we follow him, we might find where my father went.
There was no drama in her voice, just a simple, almost painful belief.
Daniel shook his head slowly. Sweetheart, I've had trained professionals looking for months. People with maps and dogs and radios.
You're telling me this cat? He broke off, unable to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. Emma didn't flinch.
She just swallowed hard and said, "Grown-ups did grown-up things. I know. But Copper doesn't care about paperwork. He cares about smell."
About where his favorite person went. And when you walked up here, he looked at you the way he looked at my dad's jacket.
Grace, steady, practical Claire, stepped in then.
"She's not saying Copper is magic," she added gently. "We're not in a fairy tale book.
We're just saying his instincts, his loyalty, might lead us where logic couldn't. Sometimes the most soulful paths in life aren't the straightest ones."
For a man like Daniel, who had spent a lifetime valuing hard work and clear facts, this was a foreign language. And yet, behind the words, he recognized something he did understand. Loyalty. He thought about the miles he'd ridden just to keep his promise to keep searching. About the little acts of love that had always mattered more than the big speeches. Laura bringing him coffee at the shop. Michael leaving a postcard even when he was angry. Animals didn't say, "I love you," or "I'm sorry." They simply stayed. Or came back. Copper's presence in that moment felt like that kind of love. Quiet, persistent, unreasonable in the best way. Claire took a small step closer, keeping her tone calm, almost conversation.
"Daniel," she said, "you're standing at a place tonight where you've already decided reason has nothing left to offer you.
Before you walk away from everything, I'm asking you to consider one last unreasonable thing. Trusting a wounded bobcat and a girl who's already lost too much." The canyon wind rushed up, carrying the smell of dust and sage. Somewhere down below, unseen water moved through the rock. Daniel glanced back at the guardrail, at the helmet he'd set down like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he looked at Emma. The way one hand clung to Copper's harness and the other curled at her side as if bracing for another disappearance. In that small, ordinary detail, he saw his granddaughter as more than a stranger's child. He saw his own bloodline of stubborn, hurting people who loved more than they knew how to say. Softly, he asked,
"What does your grandmother say about all this?"
Emma took a breath, like she was quoting something she'd carried in her chest.
"She says, maybe God sends animals when people stop listening to each other," Emma answered. "She says Copper is my kindness from heaven."
My reminder that love doesn't always look the way we expect.
For a man who'd spent years avoiding anything that sounded like faith, those words didn't feel like a sermon. They felt like a hand held out in the dark.
You might know that feeling too. The moment when something small, a dog refusing to leave your side, a cat sleeping on your chest the week you get bad news, feels less like a coincidence and more like a message. You are not as alone as you think. There, on that overlook, Daniel realized he had two choices. One was clear, final, and easy in a terrible way. A single step, and every question would go unanswered forever. The other was messy, uncertain. It meant opening himself up to the possibility of more pain, of finding Michael hurt, or gone, or simply unwilling to be found. It meant letting hope back in, with all its risks. The first choice belonged to despair. The second belonged to love. He closed his eyes for a moment and pictured Michael at 10 years old, grinning under two big goggles, riding a beat-up dirt bike behind the garage. He remembered the way his boy had looked over his shoulder, waiting to see if his father was proud. If love could cross that much time and still hurt this much, maybe it deserved one more reckless act. Daniel opened his eyes, looked at Copper, looked at Emma. "All right," he said, voice low but steady. "If your bobcat thinks he knows where my son is, then we follow him." Emma's shoulders dropped just a fraction, as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. Copper chirped, a small, rough sound,
and turned his head toward the tree line, muscles tensing in quiet readiness. Claire nodded once, as if sealing an agreement.
"We'll need supplies," she said. "Water, flashlights. I'll call Rose, let her know where we're going. This isn't a sprint, it's a hike.
We do it right, or we don't do it."
Even in this strange, almost mystical moment, there was practicality.
That balance between heart and head is where a lot of real-life moral stories actually live. As they loaded Copper back into his travel crate and gathered what they needed from Claire's truck, the sky above the canyon deepened from blue to indigo. The first stars appeared, faint and patient. Daniel picked up his helmet, hesitated, then strapped it to the bike instead of putting it on. For the first time in months, the machine at his back wasn't a symbol of escape. It was just a way to get from one place to another, nothing more. You fell into step beside Emma and Claire as they started toward the service road that led into the hills. Copper moved ahead, ears sharp, tail flicking, as if some old memory had finally been permitted to surface. As we follow them into that tree line, it might be worth asking yourself a quiet question. If something, or someone, unexpected offered you one last chance to search for healing, would you take it? Even if it meant walking into the unknown? Because in the next part of this story, that unknown will take shape in the form of an old mountain cabin, a sick man with a camera, and a truth that will change everything Daniel thought he knew about love, loyalty, and what it really means to come home. There are some doors in life we're afraid to open, not because we don't know what's behind them, but because, deep down, we do. That's what waited at the end of Copper's trail. A weathered cabin in the fir trees, and the truth Daniel had been chasing for 6 long, empty months. The hike into the Nehalem Ridge wasn't dramatic in the movie sense. There were no soaring soundtracks, no fast cuts, just the steady crunch of boots on old logging roads, the soft pad of a bobcat up ahead, and 3 humans breathing hard in the thin, cool air. Copper moved with a quiet urgency, not frantic, just sure. Nose to the wind, tail flicking, he checked the scent in front of him, then the ground, then the shifting breeze. Now and then he glanced back at Emma, as if to make sure she was still coming. Claire carried the pack with the first aid kit and water. Emma held Copper's lead in one hand and clutched the strap of her backpack with the other. Daniel walked a step behind them both, heart beating too fast for a man his age who hadn't taken good care of himself in a long time. The forest closed around them. Douglas fir, hemlock, ferns shoulder high. The air smelled of wet needles, old rain, and the faint tang of wood smoke hanging somewhere ahead. The kind that says someone has been living just far enough away not to be seen. Every so often, Claire would point out something practical. "Watch that root. Careful, that rock rolls." It kept them in the moment, kept this from turning into a rushed fairy tale quest. This was real ground, real risk, real bodies that could tire. As they followed Copper, we stepped for a moment into another time, into Michael's steps on this same trail. Months earlier, before the missing posters, before the cliff, Michael had walked this road alone. He'd parked his truck farther down, taken only a pack, his camera, and a folder of test results he couldn't bear to read again. In a city hospital, under fluorescent lights, a doctor had pointed to a scan and used words that changed everything. Advanced, aggressive, lymphoma. There was talk of treatment, of possible months, maybe a year. No promises. A lot of pain. Michael had nodded, asked the right questions, signed what he needed to sign, and then gone home and stared at Emma's drawings on the fridge. Crayon hearts, bobcats from a nature show they'd watched together, a family portrait with 3 smiling faces, and the word happy written in uneven letters. He tried to picture his daughter watching him fade. The weight loss, the hospital beds, the beeping machines. Every time he did, his throat closed. Some people get braver when they're given a diagnosis. Some get quiet. Some run. Michael did a little of all 3. He wrote letters to Emma, to Rose, even to Daniel. Started them, crossed them out, started again. "Sweetheart, I'm sick, but I'll fight. Mom, I don't want Emma to remember me this way."
Dad, I'm scared, and I don't know how to ask for help from the man I spent half my life trying to forgive.
None of those drafts felt right. None of them felt strong enough to hold his fear and his love at the same time. So he folded the test results, tucked them into a folder, and drove toward the mountains instead. There, near the ridge, was an old fire lookout cabin he'd once photographed for a short nature piece. Empty, half forgotten. A place where he'd stood years before and thought, if I ever needed to disappear, this would be the spot. He hadn't meant it then. Now, he did. Inside the cabin, he swept dust off a narrow cot, checked the old stove, and tested the door latch. On the wall, he pinned one of Emma's photos, a picture she'd taken with his camera of Copper at the rehab center, head tilted just so, eyes soulful and stubborn. This is my spot now, he told the empty room. Our spot. Yours in the picture. Mine is in the bed. When you strip away the survival talk and the poor decisions, what he was really trying to do was this: protect his daughter from watching him die. It was love, twisted by fear. Not the kind of love we see in heartwarming stories, where everyone makes noble choices, but a very human, very flawed kind of love that many parents, especially fathers raised to be stoic, might recognize. He told himself that disappearing was an act of kindness. He wasn't ready to see that it was also an act of abandonment. Back in the present, Copper crested a rise and paused. The trees opened just enough to reveal a clearing, and in that clearing sat the cabin. Tilted slightly, patched with mismatched boards, the metal chimney smoked weakly. The sight hit Daniel like a physical blow. For half a year, the search had been made of rumors, maps, and police stations. Now, finally, there was a real place. 4 walls, a roof, a door. Copper didn't hesitate. He trotted straight toward the small porch, tail up, then sat by the steps and looked back as if to say, this is as far as my part goes. Emma's hand trembled on the lead. Claire put a steady palm on her shoulder. We go slow, she whispered. We knock. We let him know it's us. Daniel walked ahead, legs unsteady. Every part of him wanted to rush, to throw the door open, to end the suspense. Another part wanted to turn and walk away, to keep his son alive in possibility, rather than risk seeing the truth. He stopped at the threshold, fist raised. For a long moment, he just breathed. If you've ever stood outside a hospital room, a lawyer's office, a house where you knew hard news was waiting, you know that pause, that tiny sliver of time where your life is still one way, and you know that once you step through, it will never be that way again. Finally, he knocked. 3 firm raps that echoed in the trees. Silence. Then, footsteps, slow, dragging. The door opened a crack, then wider. Michael stood there, thinner than any memory Daniel carried. Cheeks hollow, eyes ringed with shadows, a knit cap pulled low, not for warmth, but to hide the hair that was no longer there. For a heartbeat, neither man spoke. Copper broke the spell first, letting out a raw, chirped call and pushing past Daniel's legs. He launched himself at Michael's knees, front paws braced on his thighs, face lifted. Michael staggered, then dropped to a crouch, arms wrapping around the bobcat's neck in a hug that would have been foolish with any other wild animal. But this was Copper, the one who'd slept near his shed, watched his fire, listened to his coughing in the night. Hey, wild thing, he whispered, voice cracking. You found me. Emma's sob caught in her throat. Michael's head snapped up at the sound. His eyes found her in the shadow just behind the porch steps.
Dad?
She said, voice high and small, as if she wasn't sure the word still fit. In that single syllable, you could hear everything. Love, hurt, longing, anger, hope. All the emotions fighting for space in one thin body. Michael's face crumpled. He stood too quickly, swayed, and caught himself on the doorframe. You shouldn't be here, he managed. I didn't want to see you sick, Emma finished, tears spilling now.
So you just didn't want us to see you at all?
She wasn't yelling. That made it worse.
It was just an honest question from a child who had already learned too much about what it feels like when people disappear. Behind her, Daniel stood frozen. Part of him wanted to rush in, break the tension, do something.
Another part knew this was a conversation that had to happen, that this was the price of Michael's choice to disappear. Michael opened his mouth, shuddered again. His hands shook.
I thought it would be easier, he said at last. If you remembered me before, healthy, strong. I didn't want your memories to be this.
He gestured weakly to his own frail body. It was a twisted love, laid bare. From a distance, we might be tempted to judge it quickly, to call it selfish, cowardly.
And there is some truth in that. But up close, when you put yourself in the place of a parent who doesn't know how to be vulnerable in front of their children, it reads differently. It reads like someone who never learned that real love, the kind that keeps its loyalty even when things are not happy or pretty, is willing to be seen in weakness, not just in strength. Emma took a tiny step forward. Copper pressed against her leg.
I would have rather watched you fight, she said softly, than wonder every night if you left because of me. Those words landed harder than any medical report.
Daniel felt them too.
For years, he'd let Michael wonder if he wasn't enough to be loved by his own father.
Now, he was watching his granddaughter wrestle with the same wound. Something in him set, like concrete, in that moment.
Whatever time they had left with Michael, days, weeks, maybe a little more, he would not let this pattern continue. Claire stepped in gently, breaking the silence without breaking the mood.
Michael, she said, we need to get you to a doctor. To hospice, somewhere warm and clean, where they can help you manage the pain. He looked from her to Daniel, then to Emma and Copper. A whole fragile universe on his front porch. Will you come with me? He asked Emma. If I go? Yes, she said without hesitation. He turned to Daniel. And you? Daniel swallowed. This time, he said, I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the sky had shifted from gray to a softer, almost silver tone. The forest felt less like a hiding place and more like a witness. They gathered what they could from the cabin, the folder of test results, a few clothes, and the picture of Emma and Copper from the wall. As they helped Michael down the steps, Copper walked at his side, every movement protective, almost loyal in a way that puts many of our human moral stories to shame. As they started back toward the trailhead to meet an ambulance, the question hanging over all of them wasn't just, how long does he have? It was, what can we do with the time that's left? In the next part of this story, we'll sit with them in the hospice room, in the beeping, quiet, antiseptic world where many of us have said our hardest goodbyes. And watch what happens when a man who ran from his pain tries, at last, to stay. And as you listen, you might gently ask yourself, if you discovered someone you loved had disappeared because they were trying to protect you from their suffering, would you want that truth, even if it hurt? Hospice rooms are the places where running usually stops. Not because people suddenly become brave, but because there's nowhere left to go. Except closer. That's what these days were for Daniel, for Michael, for Emma, and even for Copper. A long, slow lesson in staying. The hospice unit sat on the quiet side of the small regional hospital. No emergency sirens here, no rushing gurneys, just soft shoes on linoleum, the steady beeping of monitors, and the low murmur of voices trying not to wake anyone. A nurse met them at the door, the kind of nurse who had seen more endings than most people want to think about, and still chose to come back every morning. She explained things simply. No big words, no false promises. We can't change the destination anymore, she said gently, glancing at Michael. But we can change the road that gets you there. Less pain, less fear, more time that feels like yours. Hospice is like that. It's not a place where hope dies. It's a place where hope changes shape. It stops hoping for a cure and starts hoping for comfort, for peace, for chances to say the things that never quite fit into busy, healthy days. For Daniel, it also became the place where he would finally practice something he'd never really learned: staying in the room when it hurt. The days quickly found their own rhythm. Morning rounds, temperature checks, meds, the soft swish of curtains opening to let in pale light. Michael, propped up by pillows, got tired just from talking. The pain meds dulled the sharp edges, but left him foggy at times. He joked with the nurses when he could, but even that took effort. Daniel claimed the chair by the bed. It wasn't comfortable, but it was close. He learned how to raise and lower the head of the bed, how to work the remote, and how to call the nurse without panicking. One morning, the nurse brought in a small shaving kit. "Sometimes it feels good to feel like yourself again," she said. "Anybody up for playing barber?" Daniel hesitated. His hands were used to metal and grease, not foam and razors near fragile skin. But Michael looked over, half a smile in his eyes. "You always hated it when I tried to grow a beard," he rasped. "Guess this is your chance to win." So Daniel pulled the bedside table closer, spread a towel, and worked slowly. Little things matter in a hospice room. A warm washcloth, fresh-smelling soap, the care someone takes not to nick you. As he shaved his son's face, he remembered doing the same motion in a mirror when Michael was small, watching the boy imitate him with a plastic razor, both of them laughing. Now, the stakes were higher, and the laughter was softer. But beneath it all was the same thing: love, quiet and stubborn. This wasn't one of those fairy tales where a miracle cure arrives at the last moment. It wasn't a happy ever after in the way we usually mean it. But these were heartwarming stories in another sense. Tiny moments of kindness and loyalty that, taken together, made the room feel less like a place of endings and more like a place of truth. Emma had her own role. She spent hours in the visitor's chair on the other side of the bed, sketchbook open, colored pencils scattered across her lap. She drew what she saw: Michael's hands with the IV, the window with the big fir tree outside, branches moving like they were breathing with them, and copper. Always copper. The hospice team bent the rules a little for him. With special permission and plenty of caution, he was allowed in for short visits. They kept him on a short lead, brought in extra blankets, and made sure no other patients were disturbed. Every time he entered the room, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't dramatic. The beeping didn't stop. The disease didn't reverse. But emotions shifted. Michael's face relaxed. His hand dropped automatically to Copper's back, fingers finding a familiar rhythm. Emma leaned closer, whispering stories to both of them. About school, about the other animals at the rehab center, about a new picture she'd taken that she thought even her photographer dad would approve of. Once, as she drew Copper's profile, she said softly, "I think he's my bridge between before and after." That's the thing about animals in these spaces. They turn rooms full of machines into places that feel a little more soulful, a little more human. Their love isn't fancy. They don't know how to give big speeches. They just show up. Again and again. Sometimes our best moral stories don't come from people at all. Of course, not every moment was gentle. One night, rain tapped at the window like impatient fingers. Rose sat on the sofa by the wall, a blanket over her knees, watching her grandson and her son-in-law breathe in uneven time. Daniel paced in the hallway, feeling the old itch, the one that used to send him to the liquor store or the bar whenever life got too loud. There was a vending machine glowing at the end of the corridor, humming like a siren. An older man in scrubs, the night chaplain, though he never used the title unless asked, stopped beside him. "Long night?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "Feels like one long night that just keeps changing rooms." The man nodded like he'd heard that before. "Hospice is a strange place," he said. "It can break you open, or it can finally let you heal. Sometimes both." He didn't preach, just patted Daniel's shoulder and moved on. Daniel stared at the machine, then back at the door to Michael's room. For the first time in his life, when pain said run, he turned the other way. He went back in, sat down, took his son's hand, Learning to stay instead of running doesn't look heroic from the outside. But inside, for a man like Daniel, it was an inspirational story all its own. One of the most important conversations happened on a Wednesday afternoon, when the light was kind and Michael was having a rare, clear day. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, Copper curled at her feet. Daniel dozed in the chair, pretending to sleep but listening to every word. "Hey," Michael said quietly, "can we talk about why I left?" Emma didn't look up from the braid she was twisting in Copper's fur, but her shoulders tensed. "You mean the cabin?"
And before that, he answered, when I stopped coming home. When I made Grandma carry more than she should have.
"When I let you think, maybe you weren't enough to keep me." She swallowed. "You did make me think that." "I know," he said. "I told myself I was protecting you. Watching me get sick would hurt you more than wondering. I thought disappearing was an act of courage." He paused, catching his breath. "It wasn't," he admitted. "It was fear. I was afraid to be seen as weak, afraid you'd look at me differently, afraid your love would change if I wasn't strong." Emma finally met his eyes. "It didn't," she said. "My love didn't change. I just didn't know where to put it." If you've ever been on either side of that sentence, the one who left or the one left behind, you know how heavy it is. In that moment, Michael did something he'd avoided with both his daughter and his father. He apologized without excuses. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I took away your chance to love me when I needed it most. I'm sorry I repeated some of what was done to me." He glanced over at Daniel, who was no longer pretending to sleep. Their eyes met, and a lifetime of unspoken things sat in that look. "I blamed you for a lot," Michael went on. "For being harsh, for making me feel small. But I made my own choices too." "I'm not saying any of this to make you feel guilty, Emma. I'm saying it so you know. When you love someone, staying, even when it's not pretty, not happy, is better than leaving them guessing." Those words may never trend on social media. They won't be stitched over in fancy fonts or turned into polished, heartwarming stories. But in that hospice room, they were worth more than any fairy tale promise. They gave Emma a new script for her own life. They gave Daniel a chance to hear his son say, "I know you tried, even when you failed." Toward the end of Michael's time, a social worker visited and spoke quietly to the family about grief groups, caregiver support, and the way healing often needs community. She mentioned that the hospital hosted a small meeting every week for people trying to stay sober while caring for loved ones. Daniel took the pamphlet, turning it over in his hands. He didn't say yes, but he didn't throw it away. That, for now, was enough. Hospice didn't erase his regrets. It just gave him a place to sit with them without a bottle in his hand. The days blurred, as they often do in places like that. Some were gentler, some were hard. Michael slept more, spoke less. Emma learned to read the numbers on the monitor without asking. Rose brought real food in Tupperware, so they didn't live on crackers and coffee. Through it all, Copper came and went, always returning to that same spot by the bed. His quiet loyalty became part of the room, a soft, wordless presence that wrapped itself around the family like an extra blanket. This wasn't a textbook happy ending, but there was a kind of love here that many of us recognize as the real thing. Raw, imperfect, willing to stay. The kind that turns ordinary hospital days into something almost holy. In the next part of our story, we'll step through the moment everyone in that room knew was coming. Michael's last day. And then out into the life that continued after he was gone. We'll see what Daniel does with the promises he made, how Emma carries her father's memory, and how Copper keeps weaving them together. Before we move there, you might take a quiet breath and ask yourself, who in your own life chose to stay beside you when it would have been easier to walk away? And if there's someone you've been keeping at arm's length because you're afraid to be seen in your weakness, is there one small step you could take toward letting them in? There's a certain silence that comes right after a last breath. It isn't the silence of an empty room. It's the silence of a world that has just changed and hasn't caught up yet. That's the silence Daniel, Emma, Rose, and Copper sat in when Michael's chest rose one final time and didn't fall again. It happened on a clear afternoon. No thunder, no storm. Just sunlight slanting through the hospice window, catching the dust in the air like tiny floating prayers. Emma's hand was in Michael's. Daniel's hand was on his son's shoulder. Copper lay across Michael's feet, eyes half closed, ears tuned to every shift in the room. Michael exhaled softly, like a man laying down a heavy pack at the end of a long trail, and then nothing. The monitor above him let out a steady tone. A nurse stepped in quietly, glanced once at the screen and turned the sound off. The absence of that beeping felt louder than any alarm. Copper lifted his head, sniffed the air, and gave a long, low yowl that rose and broke like a sob. Then he settled his chin back on Michael's ankle, as if refusing to move just yet. No one spoke. There are moments words can't touch, and this was one of them. The days that followed blurred together. Paperwork, signatures, phone calls, the logistics of loss. There's nothing soulful about filling out forms that say next of kin when your heart is still standing in that quiet room. The funeral was small, just like Michael would have wanted. A hillside cemetery overlooking the river and the distant line of the ridge where the cabin stood. The pastor kept it simple. A few verses, a few memories. No attempt to turn this into one of those shiny, unreal fairy tales where everything makes sense. People stood in little clusters. Neighbors from Riverbend, a couple of nurses from hospice. Claire in her worn work jacket, hands folded, face calm but wet. Emma stepped forward, holding a framed photo she'd taken herself. Her father sitting on a log, camera in hand, Copper half in shadow beside him. The kind of image you'd expect to see in a collection of moral stories about humans and animals and the strange, quiet loyalty between them. She placed it gently on the casket. "Now you can see us," she whispered, "even from here." Rose slipped an arm around her shoulders. Daniel stood on the other side, not quite trusting himself to speak. His emotions felt too big for his own body, like they might split him if he let them out all at once. When the service ended, people walked past one by one, offering the same phrases we all offer when we don't know what else to say. "He's at peace now. He was so proud of you. If you need anything." Most of them meant it. Grief has a way of reminding communities what kindness looks like. That night, after they dropped Rose and Emma at the house, Daniel went back to his small rental. The place felt wrong. Too quiet, too sober. There on the counter sat a bottle he'd bought weeks earlier, just in case. The old habit, waiting patiently. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. For years, this had been his way of numbing the sharp edges, turning grief into a dull ache he could ignore. He thought about Michael's last clear words to him. "She needs you clear, Dad. Don't disappear just because I did." He pictured Emma asleep in the bed down the hall at Rose's house, Copper curled at her feet, the whole fragile new family structure balanced on a promise he'd made. For a long moment, it was just him, the bottle, and the memory of every time he'd chosen alcohol instead of presence. Then, quietly, he walked to the sink. He unscrewed the cap, tilted the bottle. Amber liquid hit the stainless steel with a soft rush. The smell rose, sharp, familiar, almost pleading, and then swirled away down the drain. It wasn't a dramatic movie-style speech, just a man, alone in a kitchen, choosing a different kind of loyalty. A small act, a big shift. In the weeks that followed, life rearranged itself around the empty place Michael left. Rose and Daniel sat at her kitchen table late into the evenings, paperwork spread out between coffee cups, custody forms, school notifications, financial messes that came with someone dying young and unprepared. "I can keep her here," Rose said once, fingers worrying the edge of a napkin. "You've got your own troubles, Daniel." He shook his head slowly. "They're our troubles now," he answered. "He was your son-in-law. He was my son. She's our girl. There it was. A new shape of family. Not the one any of them had dreamed of. Not simple, not neat, but real. They agreed on a plan. Emma would live primarily with Rose. Daniel would be there every day. Mornings before school, evenings after the garage, weekends for longer visits. Over time, as things settled, they'd see what needed to change. The old Daniel might have used that flexibility as an escape hatch. The new Daniel treated it like a privilege. He started showing up at Emma's school events, music nights, art shows, that awkward bring a family member day in class where everyone else seemed to arrive in pairs. Emma would scan the crowd looking for a familiar face. She found two, Rose with her knotted hands and warm smile, and Daniel with his weathered jacket and careful hope. Copper, of course, couldn't go to school, but every afternoon, he was waiting at the door of the rehab center when Emma arrived, tail twitching. The staff joked that he had a better sense of time than the clocks. That bobcat became more than just a healed wildcat. He was a daily reminder of how love sometimes shows up in ways that could never be planned. A bridge between loss and the fragile beginnings of something like happiness. Daniel also did something no one in town would have bet on a year earlier. He went to that little support group the social worker had mentioned. Not right away. The pamphlet from the hospice room sat in his jacket pocket for a week, edges softening. One Thursday he pulled it out, read it again, and found himself standing outside the church basement, printed on the front. Inside, there were no halos, just a circle of metal chairs, a coffee pot, a tray of store-brand cookies, and a handful of people who looked as tired and ordinary as he felt. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't tell the whole story. Not yet. He just said, "My name's Daniel. I lost my son. I've spent most of my life running from pain. I'd like to try something else." Heads nodded. A woman across the circle wiped her eyes. In that simple exchange, he found something he hadn't realized he needed. Community. People who weren't asking him to be inspirational or strong or perfect, just honest. Rose and Daniel's relationship changed too. They started as two people who loved the same hurting child and shared the same grief. Over late-night cups of tea, they discovered they also shared something else: regret. Rose spoke about times she'd been too tired to notice how lonely Hannah had been before the accident, about the little dismissals that haunted her now. Daniel confessed the words he'd thrown at Michael, the bedroom door he hadn't opened in time, the years of phone calls he'd let go to voicemail. They didn't try to fix each other. They just listened. There's a quiet kind of healing that happens when two older people admit, "I messed up," and the other one doesn't walk away. It's not flashy enough to make most heartwarming stories online. But for folks in their 50s, 60s, 70s, it can feel like fresh air after years of breathing the same stale shame. Through all of this, Emma watched. She watched Daniel keep his promise. Watched Rose lean on someone else for the first time in years. Watched Copper pace the hallway when one of them was late, then settle only when the family circle was complete again. Her own heart was still tender, still learning how to trust that people could stay. But every routine helped. The three of them, Emma, Daniel, Rose, sitting on the back steps after dinner. Copper sprawled at their feet, talking about nothing and everything. The first time Emma fell asleep on Daniel's couch, math book open on her chest, and he covered her with a blanket instead of waking her to send her home. The day she brought home a photo from her own camera, a picture of Copper in the doorway, light wrapping around him in a way that made the image feel almost soulful. And Daniel said with real pride, "Your dad would have loved that shot." Grief was still there. It probably always would be. But it no longer filled every room. There was space now for other things. Laughter, boredom, small frustrations over homework, small joys like a perfectly brewed cup of coffee or a well-tuned engine. These aren't the kinds of details that end up in big, dramatic, inspirational story montages, but in real life, they are the stitches that hold a repaired heart together. In the next and final part of this story, we'll step forward a few years. We'll see who Emma becomes, what Daniel does with his second chance at family, and how the town of Riverbend
keeps telling the story of a bobcat who wouldn't forget, a biker who didn't jump, and a family that learned, slowly, to stay. Before we go there, you might quietly ask yourself, is there someone in your own life you could offer a second chance to, or ask a second chance from, even in a small, everyday way? Sometimes the road back to each other doesn't start with big speeches. Sometimes it starts with, I'll be there tomorrow, and the day after that. Years later, if you sit long enough in the diner in River Bend, the story will find you. It always does. It starts as a passing mention of a coffee, a half-whispered, remember when that biker almost went over the ridge? And then someone adds, and the bobcat that wouldn't forget him. By dessert, you've heard about a family that almost broke for good, and somehow didn't. The years have moved on, as they do. The mill whistles blow at different hours now. Some of the old shops on Main have new signs, new owners, fresh paint over fading letters. But out at the edge of town, near the fir trees and the gravel road, the Wildlife Rehab Center still stands. The fences have been reinforced. The education barn now has a small classroom, with folding chairs and a projector that hums gently when it's turned on. If you walk in on a school day, you'll likely find Emma standing at the front, a camera hanging at her hip, hair pulled back, voice steady and patient. She talks to kids the way Claire once talked to her, not as if they're fragile, but as if they're capable of understanding big things. Today's group is fourth graders from the elementary school. They wriggle on their seats, sneakers tapping, jackets half-zip. On the screen behind Emma is a slide that simply says, Wild Neighbors. She doesn't start with statistics. She starts with a story. There was a time, she says, when a hurt bobcat showed up on the edge of town, and a hurt man, and a hurt little girl, and a tired old biker all needed the same thing and didn't know it yet. Somewhere for their grief to go. The kids quiet down, sensing that this isn't just a nature talk. Emma gestures toward the enclosure outside, where Copper moves more slowly than he used to, but still with that same self-contained grace. His muzzle is grayer, his naps longer. Yet when Emma steps close to the fence, his ears tilt forward in the old familiar way. She explains how bobcats live on the edge of human spaces, how they're not monsters or mascots, just animals trying to survive. She talks about the night Copper was found, the cabin, and how a wild heart somehow stitched 3 generations back into each other's lives. She doesn't make herself the center. She doesn't dramatize it. She just tells it straight, with a warmth that makes the kids lean in. To them, it sounds almost like a modern fairy tale, but one that actually happened on the roads their parents drive every day. In this town, that story has become one of their quiet, moral stories. Not the kind that scolds, but the kind that lingers in the back of your mind when you're tempted to hang up on someone instead of hearing them out. People repeat it when neighbors fight, when someone loses a loved one, when a teenager storms out, and folks start to worry. Remember, Daniel, they say. Remember, Emma. Remember, Copper. It has turned into one of those heartwarming stories. The community holds up not because everything turned out perfectly, but because love and loyalty somehow grew where there should have only been regret. On Thursday evenings, in the church basement where Daniel once stammered through his first group meeting, the coffee pot still sputters to life. Different faces sit in the circle now, but the older regulars know him. They've watched him come back week after week, even on the days when the cravings were louder than his resolve. He doesn't talk much about motorcycles anymore, or about the night at the cliff. When he shares, he tends to talk about Emma, about my granddaughter's latest photo, about how proud her dad would be, about how strange and good it feels to be trusted again. If you passed him on the street, you might just see another aging man in a worn jacket. But those who know him see more. They see someone who once used the open road to escape every uncomfortable feeling, and now uses that same road to ride Emma to early morning photo shoots. Fog over the river, deer at the tree line, Copper in the doorway of his enclosure, bathed in soft golden light. Those images have a soulful quality to them that reminds people of Michael. It's as if, through her lens, the love he had for small, ordinary beauty is still moving through the world. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, You can find Daniel and Emma at the overlook, where it all nearly ended. The bike is parked a safe distance from the rail now. They lean against the hood of the truck or sit on the low concrete barrier, watching the sun slip behind the canyon. It's not a sad place anymore. It's a measuring place. A reminder of how close they came to losing not just Michael, but each other. A reminder that life doesn't always give us happy endings, but it sometimes offers second chances that feel just as precious. If you listened in on their conversations, you'd hear very ordinary things. Grocery lists, plans for the weekend, gentle teasing about Daniel's careful driving. Beneath it, you'd feel something deeper, this shared understanding that every simple day together is a kind of quiet miracle. No fireworks, just the steady, everyday miracle of people choosing to stay. But up close, it's made of small decisions. A girl choosing to visit a rehab center instead of shutting down. A wild animal chooses to come closer instead of running. A father choosing to walk into a hospice room instead of the nearest bar. A grandfather choosing to pour a bottle down the sink. None of these moments looked like much while they were happening. Together, they changed a family. For many folks in Riverbend, the tale of Emma, Daniel, and Copper has become one of those stories you tell when you need to remember what kindness looks like in real life. When you want to remind yourself that love doesn't always arrive dressed up as we expect, and that the most powerful forms of loyalty are often quiet. A hand held, a chair pulled closer, a wild creature lying at the foot of a bed and simply refusing to leave. Maybe as you've watched and listened, someone came to mind, a person, or even an animal whose presence held you up in a hard season. Maybe you see a place in your own story where you've been running, or staying silent, or holding back an apology you know you need to give. Before we end, I'd like to gently invite you to let this story sit with your own life for a moment. Ask yourself, is there a call you've been avoiding? A conversation you've been putting off? A simple act of love that feels small but might mean the world to someone who thinks they've been forgotten? If this journey with Daniel, Emma, and Copper has touched something in you, if it's reminded you of the beauty in second chances, or the healing that can come from unexpected places, feel free to give this video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. It helps this little corner of the internet keep sharing these more human, more healing moments. And if you'd like to go one step further, your super thanks, or donation, no matter how small, can help real centers like the one in our story rescue, care for, and heal wild animals like bobcats who are caught between our world and theirs. Together, in our own quiet ways, we can keep turning pain into something a little more gentle and keep telling the kinds of stories that remind us we're still capable of love.